right, we are live. Hello, and welcome to myUX, a podcast with me, Matthew Ventures, and my best friend about games we like or don't like. I don't know. Right now, I think we're going to talk about games that we like, but maybe at some point we'll go into bad games and stuff like that too.
I think there's so much you can learn from something. Well, first of all, I think a lot of it's subjective, right? Like what you and I think is a bad game, or what I think is a bad game, you may think is a great game. So if that's the first thing I'd say about good versus bad games. And the second thing, even if a game is definitively bad, even though that contradicts literally what I just said, but if you think a game is definitively bad, there's still a lot you can learn from that game. Like, why do you think it's a bad game? What makes it a bad game? I honestly think sometimes you can learn more from a game that you think is bad than a game that you think is good.
Yeah, I agree. So what would you say then you learned from the beginner's guide? What was the thing you learned from? Apparently not much if you thought it was good.
The beginner's guide is such an interest. Let me just say at the start of this discussion about the beginner's guide,
Sure.
it's almost like a catch-22 when you talk about the beginner's guide because it's a game that's like don't talk about. Obviously, you can't. You don't. It doesn't want you to talk about the creator of the game, or at least that's how I kind of took it. Is because the story is about this guy. We'll just give a brief spoiler alert, just
Yeah, it's
FYI,
huge
anybody who's
spoilers.
listening.
This whole series.
We'll be spoiling the whole game. So the game begins with Davey Wreden, who is the actual creator of the game. That's his name, right? Like his real life name, introducing you to a guy named Coda. Coda is the character in the game, his games, Coda's games. So to explain that in a way that makes a little more sense, is you're introduced to the game by getting inserted into a game that Coda has made, and Davey Wreden is narrating that game, right? He's like, hey, this is my friend Coda's games, and I'm going to show you around these games. And the interesting thing about that, it's already interesting right off the bat, in my opinion, because the game tells the game is almost an indictment, or at least is how I viewed it, of Davey Wreden, because he's constantly reading into Coda's games, and he's trying to understand the person behind the game, right? And even at one point in the story, when he's looking at the little orbs on the ground, the little notes, he says, "That's why I love games, right? Or that's why I love these games because I get to know the person. I can really know them by
Yeah.
playing their games." Which is, or at least I thought the game was criticizing Davey Wreden because it's like, well, you don't know, he doesn't know Coda, and as we don't know Davey Wreden, but the game invites you to know Davey, right? Because clearly it's his name. It's the name of the developer. Is the start of it, and also he gives you his personal email at the start of the game, davyreedon@gmail.com, and it's like, send me your insights about the game and let me hear what you think about it. So it's almost inviting you to know Davey Wreden, but it's about also not trying to understand the person who made the game. So it's this weird kind of catch-22, or at least I think it is.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with what you said there. I feel there's a lot of different directions which the game pulls you in. One of the reviews of this game, I should talk about the reviews at the end, but one of the reviews, which I loved, it really did aggravate me, it said that this game is super duper linear. And I think that this game is not very linear. I think it goes in a path and then it does a complete 180 and it's got a serious twist. It's got a serious plot twist, and I love that. And I think when I first played this game, that's what made the entire game for me. Did you foresee that coming, Scott? Because after going through it again, I see a lot of like hints of like what Code is doing all along.
I mean, I don't know what the heck you're talking about because obviously the game is linear though, right? Like you can't, if you make decision, you can't what is a decision you can make in the game that changes it? You know what I mean? Like you're kind of on a path. Even I'll give you an example. So even when you try to do that puzzle, right? Like the door puzzle thing, you can't choose to not do the puzzle because Davey's just like, oh, you can't do the puzzle? I'll help you out. And like he does the puzzle thing for you,
Right, but
right?
that's different though, because what you're saying is that it's linear because you can only move as like an entity through the game world
Yeah.
in a certain way, but the narrative itself is a non-linear narrative in the fact that it's going in a direction and then it has a plot twist, right? A twist being the opposite of something that's linear. Or take a book, for example. every book in that case would be a non-linear would be a linear book, right? Because you'd have to turn the page.
No, I disagree with what you're saying totally. Like I view it more so as like a linear book would be one. Well, it's hard to because books and games are very different. But a linear game is a game, or at least this is my definition of it, where your choices don't really impact the story. You can't bring it on a different route. You can't significantly change the direction of the story, right? Like it's a game that you're on a path and you're just following that path. It's like
So
What
if it could,
Remains of Edith Finch
yeah.
or The Beginner's Guide are both very linear games. A game like Fallout 3 or Fallout 4 or Witcher 3, I would consider not a linear game.
And now, are you just saying that though because the twists are player authoritative? Like if there were twists in a game, and but you weren't in control of them, would you say that's a linear game?
Yeah, I would still say that's a linear
Okay.
game because you have no direction. Where I get what you're saying, and you
But
can
I
tell.
think there's a one kind of space removed.
I get what you're saying. Is you could tell a non-linear narrative. For example, Pulp Fiction is a movie that's non-linear,
Oh
right?
yeah, sure.
Because
You go back and forth, right?
yeah, you go back and forth, and that's. I guess you're right in a sense that that's a non-linear. That's a non-linear way of telling a story. But I guess my version of it when you're playing a game, when I hear somebody call a game linear, to me that's what my definition was, which means you're on one track and you can't do anything to substantially change that track, or at least that's how I view when somebody says a game is linear. That's kind of what I think they mean by it and what I mean by it.
Yeah. Um.
So by that definition, I think of the Beginner's Guide as a very linear game. That said, I don't think it's a bad game at
Yeah,
all.
I don't think that's a bad thing either. I wanted to touch upon something you mentioned though, the puzzle of pulling the lever, because I feel like that mechanic is really presented as it's presented as something really special, and I think Davey does a good job of kind of building it up. But I think eventually, as you play through the game, it doesn't really hold up, and I feel that especially after I view it again, um, it just a lot of the parts of the game narrative wise just don't really make hold up to scrutiny. The mechanic, right? Let's see. So I didn't like the part about the prisons where you're seeing the different prisons he makes. I got a little boring in that. I don't know what exactly it was, but I did like the concept of having these assets and kind of reusing them and seeing different perspectives. But talking about the two-door space, I wanted to touch on that for a moment. Davy says a line of dialogue in the story or monologue is you have to stay alive by moving through the dark space. And I think that's a narrative for depression, and I think a lot of the game is analogous to kind of the sadness that comes maybe with building a game and stuff like that. But what really doesn't work is that he's kind of interpreting it that way, the game that's in front of him, and then he's saying like, oh, and this is why Coda has problems. But in reality, he later goes back and explains that, in fact, that actually wasn't the game. It was always a game where you just repeatedly cleaned your room. You kept on cleaning the sheets. And it's almost like he invented the flaw in Coda by ending the game and allowing you to transverse through the darkness, which was never even necessary in Coda's universe. And I don't know. I just feel like there's a lot of plot holes there, which sort of come up as you look at the different parts of the game. And it's funny because none of this stuff really affected my experience. The Beginner's Guide is my favorite game of all time, and I think that's mostly reflective, as with most people in their favorite games, of where I was at that time in my life, and that I needed this game. Whereas I think now I'm a lot more confident with who I am and who I am as a creator, and I have a harder time empathizing with this character. But yeah, I don't know. I feel like the lever analogy is the biggest sore spot for me, because I feel like there's a lot of narrative weight put on this sort of mechanic of being in a dark space, and I don't really think it's paid off in the way that he says it is. There's one part where you teach someone else how to do the door puzzle. You have to explain to them through dialogue, but that's the only part that I feel was lacking. It didn't seem to make a lot of sense.
Yeah. No, I think that's really interesting. What was the part of the game that connected? You said it really connected to you at a time, year, or maybe a year ago or whenever. What was the part that really connected with you?
Um, Man, I there's a lot. Well, it's interesting because each time I look at it, there's different parts that kind of seep out of the woodwork for me. But some of my favorite parts in this game are I think a lot of this game is just moments, and that's something I really loved about it. Speaking to the aesthetic side of things, this game hits so many vibes really, really well. I love the comments room. It instantly made me feel like I was in this sort of like message board, and that these were real people. I was reading their posts, and I love that concept. Likewise, there was a lot of images like the talking professor, which now after doing teaching in a lecture hall, like I could feel it, man. I could feel what he's talking about, and the box heads that rotate, like that is just it's such an iconic image. The machine as well, which I know you love especially. Um, and one thing that I forgot was actually the breath game, where you're just walking and there's like a deep breath, and that reveals the next part of the game. I love that.
Hmm. And what were you saying about the bedrooms cleaning? I just want to clarify. So you go into to explain that if somebody hasn't even played the game, which I think both of us would recommend it. Um,
So I actually wouldn't. This is on my recommended list as a -1. It's a hard
oh,
anti-recommendation.
all right.
It's
Well,
it's
why,
it's
why
pretty
is that?
silly,
Why
right?
is it?
Well, so I have a recommendations page on my website, mrventures.net/recommendations. Head over there now. And
Promotion.
basically, I list the games in order of my favorite, and the beginner's guide is without a doubt at the top. It's my favorite game. But I also list recommendations because I don't feel those are the same thing. And I think it's very interesting to look at the numbers compared against the rankings because though the beginner's guide is my favorite, I really don't recommend it to people. And I'll get into this in a moment looking at the reviews, but I think the vast majority of people just aren't going to take away what I took away from this game, and they're not going to appreciate it. And that's not as like a I feel that can come off very easily as like a pretentious, like only I can understand. But as I get older, I understand it less and less. To be honest, I feel like you'd have to be in the kind of headspace that I was at that time, at that age, at that place in my life to get the experience I did.
Do you think that's a negative of the game, or do you think that that is more so just the nature of that game?
I don't think it's a negative of the game. I don't think that an experience needs to be repeatable to be timeless. For example, the Shawshank Redemption, right? Everybody loves that movie, but it's a big plot twist, right? And I think if you knew what was happening, it wouldn't be as cool. I envy the people who get to see Star Wars without knowing the narrative weight of the line Luke, I am your father. Because that is like the biggest plot twist in like the history of cinema, right? But it's also the most ruined one, right? And I think that's really sad. This game is so niche and in the middle of freaking nowhere. No one would have heard of this if it wasn't for Stanley Parable. Um, I think because of that, it's a real opportunity to show someone something that they probably haven't experienced. Yeah.
Hmm, that's interesting. So you would say though, like it's interesting though that you have it at a -1 still though, because it's like you're saying it's your favorite game and that yeah, everybody can maybe everybody who's created anything can kind of relate to it in a sense, but you're like, oh, nobody should play it. Do you think that's because you want it just for you and that you don't want anybody else to play your favorite game?
I believe that the majority of players would not enjoy this game. The
Okay.
majority of players. Now, it's interesting though because someone did reflect this to me because they were like, "Well, the people who go to your recommendation site, they're
Yeah.
not the average Joe, right? It's someone who's clearly in your circle, and maybe has some empathy with your worldview." And I think that's something I didn't account for. But I think I'm putting this up there for the everyman, the Dean Kahashis of the world.
Because everybody's looking at your page and looking for
Well,
games.
I feel like people
Gotcha.
know where they stand relative to the average, right? They might not know where they stand relative to me, and if they want to know what I like, then they can play it in the order that it's listed, because that is my favorite. So I give them both sides.
Gotcha. Anyway, so you were saying about the cleaning the bedroom thing. And correct me if I'm wrong, because I may have. You were saying that the game itself, you infinitely clean the bedroom, but then Davy changes the game in order to make it so you have to move on. Is that what you had said?
Right. So
Okay.
so Davy says, no, so he doesn't reveal this until later. But basically, the game is infinite. Davy later tells you that he changed it from being infinite to make you pass through the
The darkness.
darkness. And
Gotcha.
at that moment, though, a lot of the narrative revolves around how Coda's making you pass through the darkness, which is used to extend his analogy of passing through the darkness between the doors. But it doesn't hold up because Coda never meant that. So Reedon would have never experienced this in the game as Coda meant it. He would have had to re-architect the whole game in order to get that point across, which we know he did, right? We know he's adding lampposts in the game. That's one of my favorite twists to the game when you
Yeah.
see on the wall, hey, stop adding lampposts in my game. I love that. But what doesn't make sense is that his own changes drive his own antagonism. Like he was antagonized by his own changes. It doesn't really make a lot of sense. That being said, I still love the game. Plot holes aside, it's got great twists. Um, but yeah, that's something I picked up on. I don't know. I'm a very technical writer, and I think game maker as well. And so like something very important for me is like for everything to kind of match up. And if there's something in the game that's really important, like the lever switch, I feel like it should bear weight to the narrative. And in this case, I don't really think it does. I think it's like a very forced. It's trying to make an analogy work, but you could see that it's sacrificing narrative cohesion.
But wait, so when does Coda make that analogy that's passing through the darkness? When does Coda say that?
He doesn't. That's what
Yeah,
Reedon says.
that's what I'm saying though, right? Is that like all and that was the point with the lamppost as well, is that you see Davey is putting all these things in Coda's game, and it's kind of like what players do to any game, right? It's like you want narrative cohesion, you want a destination, you want it all to you wrap everything up in a nice little bow, and that's what a lot of people want and a lot of players want. So my point is like well, you had said, "Oh, Coda intended whatever." We don't know what Coda intended, right?
Well, we know the game wasn't supposed to end. We know it was
Okay,
supposed to be infinite. And that's kind of Coda's whole thing, right? Because Coda is this artist who makes games that are sometimes unplayable, many times unwinnable. And I think that's wonderful because there's not enough games where that's the case, right? I
yeah,
think,
but you sell a game like, and this is against the whatever, but like, it's like you can never release a game like that. Imagine if somebody released a $5 game and you go into a prison and you have to wait there for 3 hours, right? I mean,
but
maybe you
like,
can.
but art exists in that medium, doesn't it? Like there is literal like there's so
Yeah.
many movements, right? When you look at art history, but there's certainly like I forget what it's called, but there's a lot of like countercultural movements, like the one where they're just showing white canvases, right? And it's like, hey, there's no paint on this canvas, and it's like, yo, dude, that's the point, you know? Well, oh, you couldn't sell that for $5, but it's like, no, people sell them for thousands. So I do
No,
feel like
you're right. You're right. Yeah.
I think that unfortunately though, Scott, you're right. Our medium is not at that level of snootiness to really be able to poach those those eyes. I don't know. I think there's a lot of situations, but there are games that are unwinnable. Okay, so I would think about, but they're just not in the limelight. For example, the
Like
game
what? Yeah.
Marriage, the Marriage. This is a game which I think John Blow talks about a lot. This is one of his favorites, I think, and it's an unwinnable game. It's a game that's there to really just put you in a place and make you experience
Well,
something.
what is it? The marriage?
The Marriage, yeah.
And what's it about? Like, what do you do?
It's about marriage, but you don't do anything related to marriage. You just feel marriage.
What is that? So what do you do in the game?
Well, we can review that game maybe on another
All
podcast.
right, let me write it down. I
Yeah, the
guess I'll
Marriage.
play it and then I'll bring back my scathing review. I guess if I like it.
Okay, yeah, we could save it for another episode.
Um, yeah.
Sorry, I just wanted to say one of my favorite things about this game, moving gears a little bit, was just how he hacked the games. I love that as a player when he's like, and I'm gonna put a bridge over here because fuck this maze. I thought that was fantastic. Because I often want to do hacks in my games, and I think that's really fun.
Well, but that brings up an interesting question, right? Because, like, okay, so at the start of the game, right, you get into the first of all, Davey's very critical of Coda's games, right? So the start of the game, you have your gun, and he's like, "Oh, this game is so like generic and stupid. Like you have a gun and you can shoot things, but there's nothing to shoot. Huh, lame, am I right?" And then he goes, "Wait a second, though. We shouldn't judge games for what they don't have. We should judge games for what they are." And he says that, and the irony of that is the next moment you go into the labyrinth, what you were talking about, and he's like, "Let's just skip this shit because like it's boring." So it's an interesting thing. Like, should you give a player the opportunity to skip whatever they want in your game, even if you put it there for this is stuff that you and I have even discussed, where it's like, well, if one player may not like the labyrinth, but does that mean that you should get rid of the labyrinth, or you should make it an optional labyrinth?
Yeah, I think it always depends, right? It's what you want as the game maker. So we did not intend for the mini game to be a. Oh, sorry. So we're talking about NSA Intern here. Basically,
Yeah,
there's a mini game which was, I think, skill prohibitive for people playing a certain part. So they needed to get through a tough game, which we didn't intend to be tough, to get to another part.
yeah.
Okay, and because of that, I think it took something away, and it wasn't intended to be tough. And because it wasn't intended to be tough, we changed it, right? But if it was intended to be tough, I think there's value to keeping it there. And I think that's why we now have another section of the game, the competition mode, which is going to fulfill that. Um, yeah. Let me
But
tell you.
yeah,
Yeah.
sorry. No, go ahead. I'm sorry. Go
Oh,
ahead.
sorry. I'm going to another topic. What were you going
Yeah,
to
yeah.
say?
I was just going to say, I just think it's a really interesting discussion because it's like, yeah, as a game developer, like imagine if Dark Souls had a super easy mode, right? Doesn't that take away from what Dark Souls is? Because one of the inherent things of Dark Souls is how challenging it is and how much you have to struggle in it, right? Like that's what a lot of people think is that game. So if you have like if it's super easy or any game really that like if you on The Witness, it was like change all the puzzles to be really easy, and then you just it's just like a line like that, then it kind of defeats the whole purpose of The Witness, right?
I think it depends. It depends on the game, right? Because The Witness is definitely a game where John is like, "Oh, you don't understand my game? Fuck you! Get out of here! Get out of my game, sucker! Let me give you something beautiful to look at." That's John's game, right? But Braid wasn't like that, right? So in Braid, you could pretty much go through the game but not collect the puzzle pieces and leave more than 2/3 of the game unfinished. Um, and I think it just depends on the game. Dark Souls actually does have an easy mode. It's called Becoming a Magic User. If you want to go hardcore, you could do a full melee run. You could do a run with no armor. I feel like there's definitely opportunities for the
No,
player to
but
set
I'm
up.
even saying like even in Dark Souls, like I'm saying a super easy mode where it's like you just get the story. You know what I
Yeah,
mean? Like, and it's like you hit all the monsters and you kill them in one hit. I'm not talking about easy mode where it's like I still get screwed in Dark
yeah,
Souls. Like I'm talking like
yeah,
super easy where you just run around and you're a god and you're just like you'd
yeah.
have to install a mod or something. But anyway,
Sure.
but
Well,
it's just an
it
interesting
depends on the
yeah.
game, right? Because this game, what would the easy mode even look like?
For beginner's guide.
Yeah,
I mean, there is a beginner's guide wouldn't have an easy mode because you just get kind of pushed through the whole game. You know what I mean? Like if there was any contention, I mean, it's interesting because when you talk about negatives about a game, it's more so what I would have liked to see in the game rather than like what I think the game needed. You know what I mean? Like what I would have liked to see in beginner's guide is a little more user input, but that's totally not what like the game is about, right? Like
yeah,
if you were allowed to change things or change the narrative, it would be a different game. And
yeah,
but that's personally, if I were to say my own issue with the game, it's that it's almost too linear and that you don't have enough choice as a player in the game to really affect the story at all. But that's kind of like me watching Pulp Fiction or a movie and being like, I don't like how I just had to sit here the whole time. Like it's
yeah.
not
Well,
really fair to
you're a very intelligent man to phrase it in such that way. I was appalled by how many reviewers had that criticism without the caveat of, But here's the thing, though. I would say that what I love about the beginner's guide is that it actually is very easy, and I think it does something better than any other game I've seen, and that is emergent tutorials. So
Hmm.
in this game, I never experienced this because I am a pretty savvy game player and I didn't have to
Whoa,
have any help. Yeah,
whoa.
yeah, yeah. It's true. It's true.
Damn, dude.
Basically, when I did the puzzle game, I figured it out. I mean, I was like, oh shit, I'm gonna get trapped in this space, but I did it because I figured that was my only option, and then I figured it out. But and same
Nice,
thing
nice.
for the spaceship situation. But what I realized, because I've showed this game to many of my friends and I've played with them next to
Even
them,
though you don't recommend it to anybody, you've shown
even
it
though
to.
I don't recommend it, because people are always like, "Oh, but it's your favorite. You gotta show me that." And I'm like, "No, let's play Gone Home." And they're like, "No, no, we gotta see the beginner's guide."
Uh, Gone home. And then I'll save that
Well, yeah,
for
we'll have
another.
another. We'll visit Mr. Gainer. But anyways, when you're
I
stuck,
like Gone. Let me just say this real fast. I like Gone home. I know
yeah,
that
we both do,
gives a
yeah.
negative. But anyway, yeah.
So when you're stuck in against the door, right? If you wait too long, Davey will come in and he'll be like, "Hey, hey, dude, this is what you got to do. This is how you do the game."
Yeah.
And I think that's really nice because I didn't realize this, but looking over the shoulder of someone who didn't know what they were doing, they needed that. And it makes me think about my games and whether or not I want to have that, right? Because John Blow is not going to come over your shoulder and be like, "Hey, hey, buddy, why don't you try moving this thing over there and using your head for once," right? Like that's not going to happen, right? But I think that there's something very approachable in this game that takes it away from that artsy aspect. So this game gets hit a few times in reviews for being, oh, it's too artsy.
Are we
But
talking? I'm sorry. Are we talking about the reception of the game now, or where are we at? Like,
maybe a little later. I
all
just wanted
right,
to touch on it for this
gotcha,
particular
gotcha.
point. But basically, the reason why I don't think it's very artsy is because it refuses to to it's uncomfortable with letting you sit. It's very much like, hey, you don't understand this. Let me explain it to you, right? Which is all
Mm.
in the narrative of Davey, right? That's totally something he'd do. So I like that a lot, and I love the emergent tutorials. It's definitely something which I learned from this game. I'd say it's the biggest takeaway in reflection.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Is emergent tutorials. I think my biggest takeaway, um, emergent tutorials is a good one. But I would say to me, it's about pacing. Because you said you felt bored at one point with the prisons, but I
Yeah.
thought the beginner's guide is actually pretty well paced because it goes by, you don't overstay your welcome really anywhere, or at least I felt I wasn't really overstaying my welcome. The prison sequence is a little long, but in general, I think the game is pretty well paced and it's really short. It's important to note the game's only like an hour and 15. Literally, this conversation may be longer than the actual game itself, you know? So my point is I really appreciate a game that is short nowadays because there's so many games that are 100 plus hours and they're great and there are a lot of great games that are 100 plus hours, but I wonder sometimes, like, well, would I rather have a 100 plus hour game or a 60-hour game where it's a really well crafted and, it could be non-linear but really well crafted? I personally nowadays, I would much rather prefer a shorter game, and I think a lot of people would agree with me, a shorter game that is better crafted than a much longer game that has a lot of arbitrary stuff in it. Now, obviously, that's subjective, but
Mm-hmm.
that's something I really appreciate about it is its pacing.
To comment on that for a second, what I would say about beginners, the pacing, which maybe keeps you enhanced, is that each of the games is pretty different, and I
Mm,
think it's
yeah.
something new each time. Where when I think about a game that's very long, in particular The Witcher, the core mechanics are actually the same throughout the whole game. Um, and they're unlike maybe like Skyrim, where there's different play styles. The Witcher's pretty set, and I think that might get a little repetitive. But
Oh,
yeah. But yeah, I think that's what
I think it's important to know we both really
yeah.
like The Witcher.
We
Don't
both
don't
love
come.
all games, yeah.
Love all games.
Yeah,
We love
all the
creating.
games.
Yeah, yeah,
But yeah, I agree. I think the pace is fantastic. That's actually the exact note I wrote down here. And what I particularly love was the character development. How Davey goes from this kind of like, yo guys, what's up, to this kind of like creepo,
yeah.
crying into the voice, hashtag cringe alert. Loved it. Loved it. Yeah,
I thought
I
if
think Davey does an
I'm
amazing
actually gonna
performance, by the way.
disagree with you a little bit, to be
Yeah.
honest with you, because another criticism, if I were to level one at the game, is that I think the ending's a little too fast,
I
or at least
agree.
in
Yeah,
my
and
opinion.
the epilogue hits you the minute after. Or no, not even, right? It's like game end, epilogue, right? The epilogue should at least come after the credits, in my opinion.
Yeah, but
Or you should go to main menu and then enter the epilogue.
it just felt like the narrative was really well crafted, and then the ending just kind of felt rushed. Or
How
at
would you
least
do
that's
it
how it.
differently? Yeah.
How would I do? I mean, that's do you ever see Chris Stuckman when he revised? People were like, "How would you do Batman versus Superman
Yeah,
differently?" And then
yeah.
he wrote a script that was like break Zod's
Oh,
neck, and
because
then
it's
everybody,
not easy, right?
yeah,
It's easy
yeah. So
to criticize. It's
my
not
point
easy
is,
to
it's
fix.
much easier for me to be like, well, the ending was rushed, and if I had a way to do it differently, honestly, I don't know what I do differently. But I think what I would do is just either let me think about that for a second. Either have a better transition into that final mission, because the final mission is like that dungeon like area where you're
Yeah.
walking through and it's all that, like maybe a game before that that was like more kind of, I guess you could say, settling, and then you could go into that, just something else. It needed something else before that ending, because the ending just kind of hits you and then it's like, oh, you're done, and it's like, oh well, and then you go. If there's any part of the game that can be called pretentious, or at least what I think could be called pretentious, is the ending where it's like you float up and you see all the labyrinths below you.
Oh boy, yeah. So that part, even on my first playthrough, I had some issues with it. And I think it's very interesting and nuanced my perspective because as a gameplay
Oh,
programmer,
your perspective is
it
nuanced and
is,
interesting.
yeah. Well, at
That's
least
how
in
you
this
know.
moment.
That's how
At
you know
least in this
somebody's gonna
moment.
have a nuanced and interesting opinion
Yeah.
when they tell you
When
that
they
their
hey, you know what? This
opinion.
is nuanced right here. Well, let me tell you this. I think you might appreciate this one. Here you go. As a gameplay programmer, I know there's no way in hell that bug would appear from doing that. And it's like, no, there's no way he
Well,
would
maybe he
begin to
intentionally
fly.
put the bug in there.
Of course he did, right? But that totally undermines the narrative, right? It's like, and then Coda found this bug, magical, right? But it's like, it's kind of like if I don't know. Imagine a crazy non sequitur in a movie or something. It's like, and then Lacey found out there was a shoe in her muffin. Ooh, emotion, and it's like, what? But why would that happen? That doesn't make any
And then at the
sense.
end, she finds a giant
It
muffin
is
with a
just a giant
giant
shoe
shoe.
in it, and it's like, but that doesn't make any, and you kind of gotta turn your brain off for a second. And I find myself doing this more and more with games where it's like I'm looking at it from a creator perspective, and then I'm like, no, you know what? I'm just the player. Let me just let them hold my hand and go along for the ride. So I love the idea of seeing the whole huge maze around you and this and building up that idea of when you saw the staircases and it's like, oh, there's so much to games that you don't see. Um, yeah, I really like that.
Oh no, I
Yeah.
definitely like that aspect of because but we already had that, right? Like at the beginning of the game, you go up and you see the huge expanse of all the things, right? And it's like, oh, look how much is behind this game. And then later on, even in the I believe it's a prison where he takes out the walls or somewhere, and then you see all the other stuff, and it's like, oh, look at, and then at the end, it's like, but look, it's even bigger. And
Right,
I'm
yeah, but
like,
you see, he really had to beat you on the head with it,
yeah,
though.
which
If you
which
wouldn't have understood it, Scott. That's the whole point. Like Davy, right? Davy's kind of, and that's the problem. Davy and Coda are like, it doesn't make sense for the story to split them, right? Because that's clearly supposed to be Coda's work, but it's Davy's thing to show you Coda's work, right? And to
Hmm,
be like, look, do you get it? You
hmm.
know? So I don't know. Maybe Coda did make the maze, but Davy added in the sort of like fly through it. At least he definitely
Maybe
did the
Davey
second
and
time. I
Coda
know.
are the same person.
Oh, yeah, oh, okay.
For
So,
all you know, they could be. You know what I mean?
well, they
Um,
are, in my personal opinion. Well, we know Coda does. Well, I don't know if that breaks. This is definitely. We're leaving the work now. So, is there any more stuff you wanted to say within the context
Well,
of
I
the
think
work?
okay, so we just kind of shit on it for a little bit, and I think that's funny that we should. I think the important thing to note there is this is both one of Matthews and I's favorite games. So like,
No,
it's
this
not like
is
we.
my favorite game,
Yeah, oh,
without a
it's
doubt.
not, yeah, yeah. So it's like it's important to note, like even though we're shitting on it, it's like it's still like one of our favorite, Matthew's favorite game, and one of my favorite games. So like, I think the important thing there is just like, oh, we can dislike aspects of things that we really like,
Yeah, no,
just to
this
make
is
that
this is like the Joseph Anderson loving rub of I love this game, man, but here's everything that I
I'm gonna show you how to get the stars in Super Mario Odyssey for 3 hours, and
yeah.
I'm gonna show you how each one. But other things I just want to say real fast I liked about the game that we didn't really touch
Oh
upon.
yeah, and then we'll go
Um,
into maybe review and the meta.
sure, sure, yeah, we'll go into the meta, which is exactly what this game is
Yeah, I
about.
know
You
the game
shouldn't do.
is the meta, right? But that's why we have
Um,
to do it.
So the thing that I really like is the contradiction, which we kind of discussed a little bit about how it's like, oh, the game invites you to know the creator, and then ultimately it's like, well, you don't know the creator really. You never know the creator of anything that you make, but in the beginning, it kind of invites you to know Davey and the fact that Davey's a real guy. And the other thing I really liked was just like the little games themselves. I really enjoyed some of Coda's games, and we kind of discussed this, but like the whole sequence of cleaning the house, it really felt like, oh, that's kind of like making a game in a lot of ways, or at least that's how I felt about it. Was like, oh, sometimes it can be very repetitive, but you find enjoyment in that kind of little repetitive nature of the thing. And it actually had some really interesting things to say, or at least in my opinion, Coda's game about like just game design in general, or in my opinion, it did, where it was like, she said something, or she or whoever it is, the person in the house, says something along the lines of, in order to have a clean house, you need to be clean yourself, or you need to be good yourself, which I think is a really interesting point in that little game that Coda made, which is like, oh, you need to be competent in of yourself in order to do other things. I thought was a really meaningful, interesting thing. And the fact that it was so repetitive, but it has that nice music kind of playing on it, created such a really wonderful mood in that game that I actually really enjoyed the game inside the game itself. And I was bothered when Davey was like, fuck you, cutting it off. And
Yeah.
it's like, well, damn, I wasn't really able to appreciate what Coda was trying to make there. And then in addition to that, later on, the machine was obviously really meaningful, at least for me, when it talks about like making a game is always fun and then a thing breaks, or I always love creating things and something breaks, because it's so true, right? It's like there's this creative machine, that's literal machine in the game, that sucks you of your creative juices and energy, and it has such a desire for all of you. It wants to consume you almost. And I thought the game did a really nice job of capturing how that feels, rather than literally talking about it. And I think that's a really powerful element of Beginner's Guide, is it's a lot of showing and not telling. And then clearly Davey does all the telling. He's like, I'm going to tell you what this door means. like,
Right,
and
right.
here, and Davey also, it's interesting because he's like, this is what it means, right? He's like, this is what I say, and this is what it means. And then obviously that's not true, right? The door has many different meanings, and the machine even has different meanings from what I said as well. And there's no definitive meaning of anything really. Like there's no singular definition of what the doors mean, or what the prison means, or what the machine means. But as players, we constantly seek that out, right? And Davy is a representation, in my opinion at least, of what that is like, of constantly wanting that lamppost, of wanting that destination, of the story being neatly put together. It's to have a game where you just sit in a prison for an hour. Literally, I said even at the start of this conversation, you can't make a game like that. Like, you know what I mean? But you can. You really can. To be honest with you, you can make that game. Now, do I think it would be a successful game? Maybe. Who knows? Maybe your game, people will be like, I sat for an hour in this prison. I don't necessarily think it will be an enjoyable experience, but do games have to be enjoyable experiences? I people disagree. So long story short, I would just say my takeaway from the game was also showing and not telling, and that it was very relatable for if you had created anything to want to. The last thing I'd say, because I know I've gone off on a little bit of a tangent, is that sometimes it feels like you want to create something in your own little bubble. And I think the beginner's guide really captured that nicely. It's just like sometimes you just want to create things for you, right? And Davey kind of deprived Coda of that ability, right? And Davey didn't understand in the context of the game that somebody would just want to create something for themselves, not because they want to share it, not because they want to make money, not because they want to whatever with it. They just created it for the sake of creating it, and it was something that was special for him, for Coda at
Yeah.
least. And Davey's like, why would anybody make these prisons? And it's
Yeah.
like, well, yeah,
On that note, it does detract a little bit from that characterization. The fact that Coda every time is sending the level to Davy.
yeah,
That part I didn't like. I would have rather it be like, oh, I found this guy named Coda who posts to this website, and I've been downloading his games. I think he's just using it as a repository. He doesn't know that I'm downloading it, but I've been kind of like stealing his games in a sense. I think that would have been a little bit better framing. Um, and then later they have the relationship where he's like, leave
And then
me
he
alone.
starts making games specifically for Dave
Right,
towards
right.
the end. And he's like, stop doing all the shit to my games. I want you not to be able to play these games.
Yeah.
And Dave's like, I don't know why you would make it so I have to build a little bridge to get through this part.
Coda's like, nah, that's the point. So
Yeah.
yeah, so interpreting this game, so when I first played, I was totally entranced. I immediately went to like Google, and I felt like I just had to hear everything about this game. And I love a movie or a game that gives me like that because I got to go and Google it right as soon as I get home. And I read this great blog post about from Davey where he's
So
talking
wait,
about.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Are we now going to indulge ourselves in exactly the opposite of what Beginner's Guide
Well,
tells us
yeah.
not to
So I,
do?
I think that's a really huge point, and it's something I actually wrote down here because let me see. Yeah, it's such a good point. Let me. Damn. So I find it's. Yeah. I did write this down. So basically, his whole thing, right, is can we judge creators by their work? And ultimately, the conclusion that the game draws is no. We shouldn't judge creators by their work. And that creators should be separated from their work, which is this death of the author paradigm. And yet, what I find so interesting is that in every review of this game, everybody mentions the Stanley Parable, which I think it was his recent game, which was a big hit, and I think it's the only reason this game really gained media attention it did, to be quite honest. And literally one of the titles was like, "It's not Stanley Parable 2," and I just, but what I really hated though, reading through these reviews, it really did get me very aggravated because so much of it was just people who just didn't get it. And I felt like I'm sure John bloated in his comment section, again getting really angry, because my oh my, it's so I saw this one review right where he has games broken down in these very distinct categories, and he's got this one category called gameplay, right? And you could tell this guy, he probably writes every review and he's got a gameplay section. He opens up with the line, given that there's no real game that's being played, it's difficult to explain how gameplay works, right? Like, it's, oh my gosh. It's so frustrating. In the end of his review, it reads, I find that it's difficult to get over the pretentiousness and forced artistness of the beginner's guide. It comes across as trying too hard to be unique and an attempt to recapture the magic of Stanley Parable when perhaps Reedon should have been trying for something new, or at the very least, should have tried for something entertaining. So I think that's hilarious. But then in his review, he does this stupid thing, right, where he bullet points the pros and the cons. And the pros, the only one he does is unique and original. But he just said it wasn't original. It doesn't make any sense. The cons are nothing to keep the player entertained, comes across as too artsy, and unrepentantly boring. And I find that so berating. By the way, this game got a 7.5 on Metacritic, which is really good. It's not amazing, right? But it's good. And
from users, and what did it get from critics?
it's both about the same, 7.58. And I just find that so interesting. Like, all these people are so focused on this idea that it has to be the Stanley Parable 2. And man, it's like, oh man, wouldn't you hate to be Toby Fox? Like, it's that kind of feeling I'm getting. But just game reviews in general, I think it's very easy to get mad at them. I was looking at the GameSpot review as well, GameSpot 8.0, and they had 3 bullet points they wanted to share with us. Unique concept, inspires thought, and lively narration. And I just thought, like, it just seems so...
What's the third? I'm sorry. You got
lively narration.
Live, okay.
I don't know. It just seems so stupid to boil it down to those.
Well, yeah, sorry to interrupt, but you bring up a really interesting point, which is with these reviews, and that guy, even though he was a little with saying gameplay, is that like these games are marketed as games. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
so when somebody goes to beginner's guide and they go, well, I was just walking around the whole time. Like they're
Yeah.
not. It's
Yeah.
important to note that it's like, even though it's very easy to laugh at that review and be like, oh, what a plebe,
Right. Yeah. He doesn't get it. Yeah.
yeah,
A
yeah, but
normie.
like it's important to note that's how the game was marketed as a game, and perhaps, and I think it's really important. I really think we need to have a genre, and people call them walking simulators, which is usually a derogatory term for them, but like some sort of genre, and it needs to be specified in Steam. Like this is more of a graphic novel, more akin, or at least in my opinion, to a graphic novel than it is to what somebody may consider to be a video game. And I
Right.
think that's actually really important
Well, here's
because,
the thing though.
yeah,
It's so similar to the Stanley Parable, and I think those would both fall into the same situation. But in the Stanley Parable, you do have user choice.
well, I think it's very different from the Stanley Parable for exactly what you just said because it has user choice. And when people go to a video game, I think, or at least this is, but you know what? Then I think of Uncharted
But
or
they'd both be in the same. They'd both be in the same genre though. They'd both be
I
walking
don't know.
sims.
I think they're different genres. I honestly think they are because of
Uh,
the difference in the user choice.
um. Yeah. One at GameSpot, it ends its line. They try to be a little artsy, and it says, "It's the beginner's guide to the meaning of video games." And I hated that line so much because there was it was completely like they didn't understand it at all, like 100%. Like the whole point was that games don't have to have a meaning, and that was their ending tagline. So that's just something I wanted to share as a very unhappiness. Sorry, so yeah, that was the main gist of my check points there. But branching on to what you had said about marketing games, this is something that really scared me when I was creating our game No Stranger, because I had seen the many reviews which waste the effort on the question of like, is this a game? Is this not a game? A conversation I completely abhor. I think it's completely useless. Just call it interactive media and go home. Um, so
You came up with the solution. Just call it interactive media.
interactive media, you're done, right? Um, but what the thing is in this game that I made, No Stranger, I deliberately marketed as it's not a game.
We made.
It's a conversation,
I
right?
think it's important because yeah, that.
We made it together, and I feel like that was a
It's
very
like-
important
yeah.
tbecause
Well, yeah, because literally the first thing we said about No Stranger is it's not a game, it's a conversation. And then a lot of people were like, "Well, why is it called a game?" Like, because on the App Store and the Google Play Store, it's still called a
yeah,
game.
why isn't this in the section next to the calculator? Why isn't this just an app?
But it's such an interesting point because how you market it will affect how it's
Yeah,
perceived.
that's a good point. And in reflection, I actually do empathize with what you're saying because I think you're right. I think the beginner's guide was marketed too much as kind of like a game, and especially in the trailer where he's like on a desktop and he's opening up folders. Like I bet at some point this game had the idea of you can traverse it in any order you want, but
Oh.
I bet it just didn't work that way. And I bet you had to take out the desktop feature and you had to have them go
How
in the right
interesting would
order.
that have been, though, when you think about it? And this is us just kind of speculating and now theory crafting about a totally different game.
Sure.
But like, imagine a game. Imagine the beginner's guide. You go to Coda's desktop, and it just has a series of games on
Yeah.
it, and you can play it in any order you want,
But
and you
that's
could
what NSA is, isn't it?
yeah. But like you could create it, you could play it in any order you want with those missions, and it gave you no context or anything like that. I think you're right. I think that may have been one of the initial versions of the game, and then people played it and was like, "Oh, this sucks,"
Yeah.
because they were probably bored, or they were probably like, "I don't know what to do. It just seems like a
Yeah.
random scrobbling of
And
games."
I feel like you can't have the narrative through lines if you don't have a pathway.
Well,
And
you could figure out something to make it work. Like I don't know, but yeah.
it's very difficult. Like when we were working on NSA, it was very hard to have apps that kind of said too much. It's hard to set yourself up in a way that an app gives you a hint that you don't understand, but you have to see another app, then you get it, right? That whole idea, that's hard to pull off.
No, you're
Um,
right. You're right. And I think ultimately the narrative style was the best version that this game could be, or at least in what the story was telling. Um, but I do wonder, like, because you're right. The trailer's like what if you found someone's games on their
Right.
laptop? And what if you dug deeper and deeper and deeper? And it was like a kind of an adventure, kind of
Yeah.
like thriller kind of thing. And then you play it and it's like, hey, I'm Davey Reedon. Why don't you email me your fan theories to
Yeah.
daveyreedon at
And it's nothing
gmail.com?
like that. Yeah, you're
Yeah.
totally right.
And then yeah, so my point is like people need to be careful about how they market their games because ultimately that's going to heavily influence your. And it's true what you said as well, which is the one of the reviews was like it ain't no Stanley Parable. Like you're not
Yeah.
going to get what you got there. And how much does that suck to like spend 2 years on a game and then like even for NSA Intern, which we released, have people be like, oh, No Stranger was pretty fantastic. But this
Yeah, no,
game's
we got a
not.
review. We got a review. It said it didn't live up to the greatness.
Yeah,
That is no stranger.
yeah, which is like, how do you respond to that? Because it's like, it's not like you're mad because you're like, wow,
Yeah.
thank you so much. But you're
Yeah.
also like, well,
Well, here's the thing. Like, I think part of it is just you do a little tear. But in general, I think that's why it's so important to not get your validation
Hmm.
from them. Like I know this game is so much better than my previous game. And I know you'd say, well, what the hell does that even mean, right? But
Yeah,
I know if you look at it along certain axes, let's just say playtime alone, the length, the technical complexity, the way that code is so goddamn sexy. Like, there's a lot of ways you could look at it and you could say, wow, this game is more, not
yeah,
necessarily
but
better.
I don't even think that is a healthy, or at least I personally don't think that's a healthy way of looking at it because then constantly you're creating this barrier to creation, or at least in my opinion, you are,
Oh,
right?
well, I don't think
Like,
it has to be better, but I'm just saying you
oh,
need
okay,
to find peace in yourself rather
exactly.
than extrapolating it from
Exactly,
the feedback of
exactly,
others.
exactly, exactly, exactly. I totally agree with that sentiment. Yeah.
Final thoughts or any other topics you want to discuss regarding the? We got about 10 more minutes before the hour mark. Regarding the beginner's guide.
I'll let you have the final thought because I feel like I've spoken a lot.
I think we've said most of it. I think this is a really great game. But I just don't think it's for everyone, and I think some people are going to take different things out of it, and I think that's what's really magical about games, and I think stories in particular. But I think this game in particular, really, stories in general, but this game in particular, games in general have a great opportunity to really make the medium be the message, where it couldn't be told in any way other than a game. And I think that's true for this game. I think there's a sort of interactivity of feeling like you're being pulled by someone who's kind of authoritative. And I really enjoyed that. And I think some people are going to love this game, some people aren't going to love it, and that's all right. We're all going to take something different from it. But all in all, it's my favorite game of all time. Clearly, I enjoyed it. Scott did as well. And if this conversation interested you, you should check it out. Well, clearly, you have ruined the whole game. But, give it a shot nonetheless.
and the last thing, and I want you because I don't want to, as I just said, I don't want to have the closing note. Do you want to just shit all over the point of the game and talk a little bit about Davey Reedon and like his blog post about Stanley Parable and how that relates to Beginner's Guide?
I think there's some stuff to be said there. Sorry, because I was going to go into that. But what you said has merit in that maybe it's not as important. But to be honest, I don't agree with the game. I think
Mm.
where the game is matters. And I think that is reflecting all of what I've said about how I don't necessarily enjoy the game playing it, but I certainly did when I first played it. Um, and I think that's okay, and your perspective matters. And I think the perspective of who made this game and what's their story is also important. So, yeah, I'd be happy to dive into that a little bit. I guess from what I know, basically his first game was a big hit, the Stanley Parable. And then I think the way that it's commonly phrased is he created this game, which is not true. He actually made them both at the same time, but it's posed as he created this game afterwards, and it's sort of the way that he deals with the depression of having so much criticism and stuff. And I believe that code is a reflection of another side of him, and really it's an internal conflict, the whole narrative. But that's only my interpretation.
And he also invites you to do that though, because in the beginning he literally made he could have been like Davey could have been like, my name's Charlie Smithers, and we're going to look at Coda's games. But he didn't do that. He did,
Right. He
my
uses his
name's,
real name.
he
Yeah.
uses his real name. He has a real email that you can actually email. And at the end, he says for somebody. He dedicates it to somebody. So he kind of like, if he didn't want people to read into his personal life, he kind of did a really like, I can't imagine that he didn't want people to read into his personal life. Like it's almost like he's like, no, don't do this, and then he gives you all these breadcrumbs, and he's like, ooh, doesn't this look really
Yeah.
tasty? Like,
Yeah, I think what makes the character work so well is I think it has a lot of truth in it. I truly was convinced. I believe that this guy, Davey, really does suffer from trying to derive, worth through his games. And I was convinced. And maybe I fell for the narrative or whatever, but I really do believe that this guy was feeling this and that a lot of these emotions are real and that he has trouble with this situation. And I know I certainly have in the past. So I think that's what I related to when I read it. I really read into that.
and what's your final takeaway from the game? Like, what's something you'll never forget from the beginner's guide?
One I'll never forget. Man, there's so much. I think the biggest thing though is just the personality. I think this was the first game I played where it wasn't afraid to give a personality and an opinion in a way that I think so many other games like Halo or big mass market games, they just don't have that sort of intimacy. I've played a lot of more games like that since then, and I find that a lot of them I connect with. Um, there's this one game. Have you played it by chance? It's called That Dragon Cancer.
I haven't played
Okay,
it.
so this is a pretty it's been a pretty big game in the sphere of walking sims, and I absolutely hate it. I abhor it. I hate the game. I was playing it and I had to put it down. I had to stop because I was so mad playing this
Mm.
game. Um, but I think it's a great game. In fact, I really enjoyed the game and it made me feel something, which not a lot of games do. And I think that's kind of magical, even if it's not necessarily something you like, right? It might just be something special that this game could touch you on an emotional level, even if it's not in the direction of joy. Um, and I think that's something really special. And I think when games put themselves out there and they choose to portray the most authentic self of the author, you can sometimes hit that. And I think that's something that we're touching upon as creators. Speaking to no stranger in NSA, so many of my friends reach out to me and they say, "Wow, I read your voice in this game," and I think
Mm.
that's really special because it's telling us that we're connecting with people on a level that feels authentic. And I think that's why so many people who play No Stranger love to see what you're up to now because they feel like their relationship developing with Adam, and as it was crystallized with your portrayal of him at the end of the game, that made them feel like they're now friends of you, right? And that's a classic like fandom of like, I feel like I'm friends with Britney Spears even if she's never met me.
But isn't that so dangerous, though, that people think they can know you through what you make? Because they don't. They don't. You know what I mean? As much as I love any fans or supporters of No Stranger or NSA Intern or anything I've made, it's like they don't really know you.
Well, what's
And
the danger
nobody,
though? Why do you say danger? What's the danger
well,
there?
because it's just interesting to me because it's like you have people that may know your address or know where you are or know your full name or know these things about you, but they don't know who you actually are, right? Like they
Yeah.
don't know, and they think they know you. Like they think they understand you and they get you, but it's like, and then what happens is a lot of the time, or at least with No Stranger in particular, is people will also reach out, right? And tell us things that are so emotional and gut wrenching and terror, like things that I feel so bad about. And you want to contact them all, or at least that's how I feel about it. Is you want to reach out to everybody. I wish I could give every single one of them a big warm hug and
Well, yeah,
write.
you can go respond to those emails from.
Yeah, but that's true. Adam Verdu, the email, and you have thousands upon thousands of emails, and it's like you
Yeah,
wish you could respond to every single one of them with a
I
really
do. I
thoughtful
really do. Yeah.
with a really thoughtful, lovely answer. But the truth of the matter is at some point you just have to go, well, I can't do this. I can't be this person for everybody because at some point it starts detracting from you being that person for yourself if you're trying to be that for everybody else. And that's the danger, in my opinion, is that people think they know you. First of all, I think that can have its own danger right? With people thinking they know you, because then they start extrapolating about things about you, and they may think things about you that aren't true, and they may believe things that they don't. It's like the vloggers on YouTube,
Right,
right?
that's what I was thinking of too. But okay, so
Yeah,
but the main point though is that that kind of scares you, that level of intimacy with people. Well, it's kind of like false intimacy, you'd say.
it doesn't scare me because because it's almost like, well, I wish I knew things about you too. But then it's like when you have 1,000 people who are like, yes, here's all the things to know about us. It's like, well, damn, you know, you can't respond to every single person as much as you'd love to. I would love to, but at a certain point, it's just unrealistic to really think you can. You know, you're not Superman. You're not some sort of god. You can't answer everyone, and that's dangerous, and that it's sad,
Yeah,
and also the fact that people think they know you. It's almost like, well, you don't really know me, and you can never really know me. Like, even and this is me going into a bit of a tangent, but nobody can really know you, right? Like, I don't really know you, right? I know what you show me, but I will never actually know what is going on in your head. And you could tell me, you're telling me what's in your head, but I will never actually know what is going on in your head.
yeah. Well, I think that's it seemed like a tangent, but it wasn't, because that's really the theme of the game in a nutshell, right? It's all about what someone chooses to portray and how you might read into what they choose to portray, and whether or not that's actually a reflection of their true self. So it's a great note to end on. Thank you, everyone who tuned in to hear two random guys talk about a game they didn't make. And yeah, and stay tuned to see what game we might review next. Thank you.
Was this a review
Was
though?
this a review? No, this was not a review. I think this was a chit chat. Let's call it that, right? Because I want to get away from the structure of the thing, right? This was, right, was my user experience.